Most people think that because they don't say nigger, they are progressive people. What's more important to me is the fact that when you hear nigger, you see my picture, meaning a black man.
Remember that clip? A quick reminder in case it's been a while since you watched Module 6. It's from the scene in the film that explored how the messages we've been receiving all our lives about the N-word can create bias in us against black people, and we usually don't even realize it. There's an academic term for this concept, implicit bias, sometimes called unconscious bias. Unconscious bias isn't only about bias against black people. That's just what Dr. Moore was talking about in his workshop. We all have biases against all sorts of groups of people, whether we're talking about race, gender, religion, ethnicity, sexuality, disability, age. There's a long list. In this bonus module, we're going to take a deeper look at implicit bias, what the term really means, why we have bias, and what we can do to interrupt it. We've got a lot to cover, so let's get started. First, let's get clear on what the term implicit bias actually means. To understand this better, let's listen to one of the leading experts on the subject. Here's Jerry Kong, the Vice Chancellor for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at UCLA.
But I want to talk about not the stone-cold racist, right? In some ways, we know what that kind of animal is. But I want to talk about sort of more subtle biases that might exist. And I do a lot of work on implicit biases, which are sort of attitudes and stereotypes that we have that we don't actually even know that we have. So just to be a little bit technical, implicit just means that you can't actually just close your eyes and ask yourself, how do I feel about a group? But it turns out our brains are really complex machines, and we don't have full introspective access to the junk that's going on in our heads. Decades of social psychological research have demonstrated that there are all these kinds of attitudes and stereotypes that we can't directly measure just by asking ourselves, that nevertheless influence our behavior. If we have this kind of junk in our heads, how might they affect our behavior?
Okay, so the term implicit bias describes what's happening when we hold stereotypes or beliefs about different types of people without having any awareness that that's what we're doing. I don't know about you, but this really bothers me. What if I have biases I don't even know about, and they're influencing what I do all the time, and I don't even realize it? What if I'm negatively affecting the people around me? And if I am, what can I do about it? The first step for all of us is to understand what kind of bias we have. This might make you nervous because you don't want to find out something about yourself that you're not proud of. I get it, me too. But here's the thing. Every human being has some kind of bias. We are wired that way. One researcher has even referred to implicit bias as an equal opportunity virus that gets in the mind of anybody, regardless of their own group membership. So how do we find out what our biases are? Well, there's actually a test you can take. It's called the Implicit Association Test, abbreviated IAT, and 3 scientists developed it back in 1998. The scientists figured out that when they displayed a series of images and descriptive terms, and then measured people's response times in matching those images with the descriptive terms, they could figure out what types of unconscious bias the test takers had. That same test still works today. It's easy to take, and it's totally confidential. We really want you to take it, and we wouldn't ask you to do something that we weren't willing to do ourselves. Members of our team at Point Made Films each agreed to take the IAT at the same time, and then share our results together. Here's what happened with us. Okay, so we're going to take the implicit association test. Do you guys know what that is?
It's a test.
Are you sure? Okay, so Harvard scientists came up with this in, I think, the late 90s, and it's this idea of just figuring out what's going on in our unconscious brain. So we can say to each other, you know, I love black people, right? Like I don't have any biases that I know about, but there's stuff going on in our unconscious brain that we have no access to. And so we can't really do anything to interrupt our biases if we don't know what they are.
I'm afraid I'm going to do what I think I should do instead of doing, you know.
Right. And is that the conscious mind? Or is that
right, yeah. So I don't know if I'm going to like override my unconscious mind by picking what.
Like try and beat the test?
Yeah, I'm trying to beat the test. I'm very beat test oriented. So that makes me
No beating the test.
I know, I think I like want to try and beat it. because that would make me feel better.
Right.
But I'm going to try and just
Be honest.
and just
Would we like whatever first response, first thing that comes into your mind,
Yeah.
as opposed to like I think like Lenny's saying, like filtering it through and being like, is this right or wrong?
Right.
All right. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm so confused.
All right, so here is your result. What'd you guys get?
Your data suggests a slight automatic preference for European Americans over African Americans. But I'm glad that it's not moderate or strong.
Why are you glad about that?
Just because I think because I've really tried to do a lot of work over the years and interrupt some of my patterns of bias that I know that I have.
Well, it's interesting because I didn't even know the slight was an option until you said that, and I looked below and I was like, oh yeah, slight is an option because I got moderate. My data suggests a moderate automatic preference for European Americans over African Americans, and that's like it's disturbing. But the moments I had during the test, and I was like, ugh. I was like, I know that this should be here, but my finger was automatic, and I was like, why did my finger go where my mind was telling me not to go? And I was like, oh, there is the living proof of implicit bias, like right there. Even though I knew it, I do this work, I focused on this, my life commitment, I still am like, yoink. And that was an intense moment. I wanted to stop the test.
So I'm a little confused, not confused, but my result says, here's your result. Your data suggests no automatic preference between African Americans and European Americans. Oh. And I'm trying to process.
You're like perfect.
I win.
You beat the test.
I did all of my subconscious, overthinking. Did it? I beat the test. So I'm trying to grapple with what that means, or what. And I think it's from my background, having been born in Jamaica, grew up in South Florida. I was always around a lot of different people.
How about the white people? What'd y'all get?
So my result is your data suggests a moderate automatic preference for white people over black people, which surprises me, actually.
Yeah, I got slight automatic preference for white people over black people. I find it interesting that like everybody's talking about it, like none of us are really pushing back on the tool itself and saying like, this is ridiculous, or like, this tool is bullshit.
I think the reason why I don't push back on it is because I found myself in real moments where I could pull myself outside of it and say, this is the correct answer I should give based on what I know is right, but my finger still went the other way. And that's what made me think that give the test a little bit more validity.
Right.
It reminds me of sometimes in our screenings when people want to sort of divert, how much self-awareness, how much do you really want to dig into this?
That's right.
So I'm going to talk about the bad lighting in that scene.
That's right.
And I hadn't thought about that there may be people who take the test who do just go,
yeah.
I could say, this says I have an automatic preference for white people or black people. F that.
Right.
This
or
thing doesn't work.
Right. That's right. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that. Like,
well, I'm sure people will.
Yeah, so it does take this level of, okay, could I just
you have to be open.
Assume that the test
is correct.
Measures something valuable.
And as we say in some of our workshops, just even if you think it is biased or it's not right, what if it were true?
Right. Yeah.
Well, I like to say, just consider it. Right. Consider the possibility if this was true.
Yeah.
I mean, no one here had a preference for black people.
Yeah.
Like straight up. Like that's just right in there, and that is something for us to think about.
And I think that like, so what keeps people operating in an unconscious way? I think it's like it's fear, right? And we're afraid to confront these things a lot of times within ourselves, right? We want to be good people, and so like we're afraid of what that means. We're afraid what that says about us. So like we want to try and not acknowledge that.
Yeah, I gotta admit it doesn't feel good. It makes me think about so much and challenge myself and wonder, but it's good to do it.
Okay, that was kind of tough. Look, our team works on issues of race and racism every day, and as you can see, we still have bias, because everybody does. Now, I'm going to get real with you here for a minute. I've noticed something over the past few years of screening our documentary and leading discussions about it. Those of us who are white tend to breathe a little easier in these conversations when we find out that people of color have bias too. I think it makes us feel better that we're not these horrible people. Of course we're not. And that's not really the point, because being a nice person isn't going to end racism. Remember that racism is bigger than just our individual beliefs. It's a system of laws, policies, and practices that were created to benefit white people, and they still do today. This system is all around us, and it's always been there. And because of that, we don't always notice it. But once we start to better understand racism, we can begin to realize how the power structures and images we've seen on a daily basis for so long have planted deep seeds of bias in all of us. Essentially, we can think of our bias as a byproduct of systemic racism. And if we don't interrupt it, we keep the system running. And here's something else, and this is really important. While it's true that all people hold bias, I need to remind myself that my bias, as a white person, can have a much more damaging effect on people of color than their bias might have on me. There's a lot of research that backs this up. Plenty of studies have shown that when someone has implicit bias against black people, they're more likely to mistake a phone or a comb for a weapon if a black person is holding it. How about in healthcare? Researchers have found that doctors don't always refer patients of color for as many tests and procedures as they do for white patients, which means people of color might not be getting the same level of care, and the doctors don't even realize it. In schools, teachers suspend kids of color at way higher rates than they do white kids for the exact same behavior. And in the working world, when hiring managers are presented with two versions of the exact same resume, one that has a white-sounding name and one that doesn't, guess who gets the job interview? The reason why this stuff happens isn't too surprising, given the racist structures and images all around us. Take a look at the images on the next screen from recent news stories. And let's take a look at the power structure of American society. Here's what the Senate looks like. Here's what the House of Representatives looks like. And here's what the heads of Fortune 500 corporations look like. What about all the leaders around you? What do they look like? So you see what I mean. Why wouldn't we have bias when we've grown up mostly with these images? So what can you do to interrupt bias or debias yourself? Well, the first step really is becoming aware of your biases. Take the IAT, like we did. When you know what your biases are, you'll start to realize when you might need to just slow down, think, and check in with yourself, especially in those moments where you think you're making so-called gut decisions about people. Once you do that, there's lots of other things you can do too. If you want some ideas, here's what our Point Made group talked about doing. Okay, so now we know these biases that we have, right? Or some of them that we've done. What do you guys think are ways we can, there's lots of different ideas about how you can interrupt them or debias yourself or what we can do.
I have to interrupt myself. Because I think what it is a lot of us, we get these thoughts in our heads, based on whatever our bias is, and we think about this. So for me, I have to, while I'm thinking about that, I have to completely stop myself and say, okay, no, that's not right. That's not the way to think. And I have to kind of talk myself out of it at the time. I think I have to keep doing that more, and that's how I have to handle it.
Well, having awareness is the first step, like you said. So, I think about it like, okay, I'm just gonna accept the results of this test, and then as I process it, I become more aware. And if I'm more aware, I just can interrupt it by saying, you know what, Nancy, you can't stand it when people make assumptions about you based on your appearance and what you look like. So don't do the same thing to somebody else.
So my thought, if I think about what I'm going to do, for me it's an intellectual exercise in terms of thinking about and processing how I'm going to deal with this internally. And then also on the practical side, just really be aware of what I do in certain situations, of who I give preference to, who I treat in different ways, really try and aggressively on a day-by-day, moment-by-moment experience of being aware of how I apply the bias.
I think that I agree with everything that everybody said. And the only thing I would add is to approach your process with a level of love and forgiveness for yourself. To not...
Thank you for saying that. Thank you.
Well, to not judge yourself and beat yourself up for having those thoughts, but to recognize that you have them and that awareness that everybody's talking about, and really be okay with that, and making sure that, like, to your point, Lenny, we're not, those things aren't defining me, those aren't shaping my decisions and my behaviors, and yeah.
Okay, now what are you going to do? Check out our course landing page for some ideas to help you get started.